Henry Caldwell, a wealthy man with a touch of arrogance, took on a bet that would end up changing his life in ways he never saw coming. Henry was accustomed to winning, whether in business or in life, and the thrill of competition fueled him. At a swanky party in New York, his good friend Tom dared him with a bold challenge. Tom, smirking, leaned in and said, "So, Henry, let us see if you can win this one. I bet you do not have the nerve to marry a woman who is nothing like your usual type." Now, Henry had always been known for dating stunning women, so the challenge took him by surprise. But, always eager to prove his mettle, he raised an eyebrow and asked, "All right, so what is the prize?" With a mischievous grin, Tom lifted his champagne glass and replied, $1 million to the winner, but you have to marry her and stay married for a full 6 months. The thrill of the competition, combined with the allure of a financial reward, had Henry agreeing without a second thought. The woman Tom had in mind was Hannah Roberts. She was not the kind of beauty Henry was used to, at least by conventional standards. Henry did not know her, but to him, this was just another deal to win. A few days later, he received more details about Hannah. She was independent, confident, and strong-willed, the opposite of the women Henry usually dated. This only piqued his curiosity more. Used to having control, he wondered how it would feel to deal with someone who would not easily bow to his influence. Their first meeting took place at an upscale restaurant. The moment Hannah arrived, Henry could tell she was different from anyone he had ever met. She did not appear intimidated by the posh setting or by Henry himself. Instead, she met his gaze with a steady, unflinching confidence. "You must be Henry Caldwell," she said plainly as she took her seat. "And you must be Hannah Roberts," Henry replied with a polite smile, extending his hand. She hesitated, then gave it a firm shake, making it clear she was not easily impressed. "Let us not dance around the topic," Hannah began in a direct tone. "I know why we are here, and I know all about the bet, the terms, and the conditions." Henry was surprised by her straightforwardness, but kept it hidden. "And yet, you still agreed to meet me?" he asked, curious about her reasons. Hannah paused before responding. "I have my reasons. Do not think I am naive, Henry. 6 months may seem short, but a lot can change in that time. If you believe you can manipulate or control me, you are mistaken." Henry was intrigued. Hannah was turning out to be more of a challenge than he had anticipated, which made things all the more interesting. As their first encounter wrapped up, Henry found himself thinking about Hannah more than he expected. She was nothing like the women he knew. She was not afraid of him, and that sparked both his curiosity and a bit of admiration. Days passed, and he could not stop pondering his next steps. He was used to leading in relationships, but now it seemed Hannah had her own rules for the game. Their second meeting took place in a small cafe, a far cry from the fancy places Henry usually dined at. Hannah had suggested it, and Henry, curious, agreed. When he arrived, she was already there, sipping tea with a calm smile. She greeted him warmly, softer than at their first meeting, but with the same unbreakable confidence. "I thought you were more of a 5-star restaurant type," she teased as Henry took his seat. "Sometimes it is nice to break routine," Henry replied, trying to sound casual, though he felt a bit out of place. They chatted lightly at first, but Hannah soon got to the point. "If we are really doing this, I want to make a few things clear," she said, setting her cup down firmly. "I am not interested in your money or your lifestyle. 6 months is 6 months, and I intend to leave the same as I came." Henry studied her carefully, sensing her honesty. Hannah was not looking for social advancement like many others might. "So, what is it you want, Hannah?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Freedom," she answered without a moment's hesitation. "I want you to know that even with this arrangement, I will not be controlled by you. I have my own life, and that will not change because of a temporary marriage." Henry nodded. To him, this was just a technicality to win the bet. If she wanted her independence, he had no problem with that. "Fine," Henry agreed. 6 months. After that, we part ways." Hannah studied him for a moment, as though to make sure he truly accepted her terms. She had her own reasons for this arrangement and intended to keep it under her control. Deep down, she knew Henry might try to steer things his way, but she trusted her resolve to hold firm. As the days slipped by and the wedding date approached, Henry began to realize that this little game might not be as straightforward as he had thought. The wedding itself was cold and businesslike, feeling more like a contract signing than a celebration. In his mind, Henry was already counting himself as the victor. He was certain the 6 months would pass quickly, and he assumed that, in time, Hannah would yield to the luxurious lifestyle he was offering. Right after the ceremony, he took her to his extravagant penthouse in New York City, a testament to his wealth. With floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the skyline and the finest decor money could buy, Henry saw this place as the battleground where he would win her over. But from the start, Hannah made it clear she would not be easily swayed. Stepping into the penthouse, she held herself with a composed distance, gazing out at the city, unimpressed by her surroundings. 6 months, Henry. Not a day more, she said firmly, looking out the window rather than at him. Henry felt confident, though. He was used to resistance at first, believing that all the women in his life had eventually given in to his charm and wealth. He assumed Hannah would be no different. In the first few days after the wedding, Henry tried everything to dazzle her. He presented her with expensive jewelry, designer clothes, and luxurious vacations, expecting she would start embracing the lifestyle he had laid out for her. But to his irritation, Hannah turned it all down. She stuck to her modest habits, unshaken by his attempts. "I do not need these things, Henry," she would say with a calm, steady tone that only made him more frustrated. Used to getting his way, Henry felt his authority was being tested in a way it never had been before. This was no longer about the bet. Now, it was personal. He was determined to get Hannah to submit. He began ramping up his tactics, even stopping her from going to work. He would tell her things like, "You do not need a paycheck anymore," or "Your role now is to be my wife." When Hannah resisted, he would keep her waiting, manipulating schedules and situations to remind her of his control. But Hannah was unyielding, standing firm against his efforts, which only intensified his desire to break her resolve. Their relationship began to feel like a standoff. Small provocations bubbled up in their daily conversations, with Hannah meeting each of Henry's moves with a sharp wit that neutralized his attempts to put her down. One particularly tense evening, Henry decided to try a more emotional approach. "I do not get you, Hannah," Henry said, looking at her with a mix of frustration and fascination. "Any other woman would be thrilled to live in all this luxury, but you act like it does not mean a thing. What is it you actually want?" Hannah, who had been calm up until now, finally lifted her gaze, her eyes sparking with an intensity that Henry had not expected. "What do I want? I want respect, Henry. I am not just some pawn on your chessboard. You think you can buy me with money, but you are wrong. Money does not bring dignity, and it sure does not bring integrity. You may have all this stuff around you, but inside, you are empty, and that is what really bothers you." Her words struck him like a punch to the gut. For the first time, Henry felt like he might be losing something more than just control. Hannah was not merely resisting his power. She was stripping away the image he had spent years building, and that rattled him. No one had ever seen him this clearly before. Beyond the wealth, and the feeling of exposure unsettled him deeply. But rather than backing down, Henry decided to press harder. He began devising ways to cut Hannah off from the outside world, determined to make her see just how difficult life would be without him. He started closing off connections, cutting ties that could help her advance in her career, and even sabotaged important projects she had been working on. But Hannah was not one to be easily scared. Each setback only seemed to make her more determined. She held her ground, refusing to let Henry mold her into something she was not. One evening, Hannah decided to show her own hand. "You think you are in control, Henry, do you?" she said with a steady, measured tone. "But what you do not know is that I have a plan too. Believe me, when the time is right, you will realize that this whole game is built on something far bigger than you ever imagined." Henry looked at her in shock. For the first time, he began to see he might have underestimated Hannah. A flicker of fear crept into his mind. Was it possible he might not come out on top in this challenge after all? The weeks drifted by, feeling like a taut rope stretched to its breaking point. Every day, the tension grew, with Henry pulling every string he could to manipulate the situation in his favor, Yet Hannah stood firm. She was like an immovable wall, and every attempt Henry made to wear her down only seemed to strengthen her resolve. Still, there was something else that Henry could not ignore. As time passed, he began to see Hannah in a new light. It was not just that he respected her resilience. There was something deeper. She was doing something no one else had ever done. She was getting under his skin in a way that made him feel raw and vulnerable. For the first time, he found himself wondering about her, not as a piece in some game, but as a person he genuinely wanted to understand. One night, after a particularly heated argument, Henry found himself alone in the spacious living room, staring out over the city through the glass windows. The city lights, which once made him feel powerful, now seemed hollow and distant. He found himself wondering why he was feeling this way. Hannah was just supposed to be a woman he had married for 6 months, nothing more than a pawn in a bet. But she was stirring something within him, something that he could not quite put his finger on. He, who had always prided himself on controlling his emotions, was starting to feel exposed, even vulnerable. As Henry wrestled with his thoughts, Hannah went about her routine as though nothing had changed. She seemed more distant with each passing day, almost like she was waiting for something. Henry sensed an invisible wall between them, one he could not break down, and it gnawed at him. He was not sure if it was pride or his deep-rooted need for control, but something about Hannah pulled him in, against all logic. "You are different," his friend Tom observed during a casual dinner, watching Henry closely. Tom, who had been the one to propose the bet, added, "Normally, you would have this all locked down by now. Looks like she is pushing you in ways no one else has." Henry forced a smile, but Tom's words struck a nerve. That night, Henry came home resolved to set things straight. He needed to clear Hannah out of his head, to remind himself that this was just a contract and nothing more. But when he entered the penthouse, he found Hannah calmly reading a book on the couch, completely unfazed by his presence. "Can we talk?" Henry broke the silence that had become the norm between them. Hannah looked up, set her book aside, and gave him an even, attentive gaze. "Of course," she replied, almost as though she had been expecting this moment. Henry took a seat across from her, feeling the weight of the tension between them. He knew he could not keep treating this marriage as a formality. Something had shifted, and he had to confront it. "What are we doing here, Hannah?" he asked, surprising himself with his own sincerity. "This started as a bet, a game. But now, I am not sure what to think." Hannah looked at him thoughtfully before responding. "I am not playing, Henry. I never was," she said, her voice calm but carrying a quiet strength. "From the beginning, I agreed to this marriage for reasons that go beyond you. I do not care about the money or your need to control things. I am here for something bigger, and if you have not figured that out by now, maybe it is time to open your eyes." Henry felt a tightening in his chest. It was as though she was hinting at something he could not yet understand, and it frustrated him deeply. "I know you have your secrets, Hannah," he said, his voice tinged with irritation. "What drives me crazy is that the more I try to figure you out, the more I realize I am not in control, and I hate that." He stood up, unable to sit still, feeling the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. Hannah, unruffled, watched his every movement, then slowly rose and walked toward him, stopping just inches away. Henry's heart beat faster as she looked him in the eye. "Henry," she said softly, "this is not about control. You have spent your whole life trying to dominate everything and everyone. But with me, you are going to have to understand that control is not always the answer. Sometimes, things just need to be what they are." For a moment, Henry felt an undeniable connection with her, like he was truly seeing Hannah for who she was, not as a pawn in his game. "So what is it you want?" he asked, his voice softened to almost a whisper. Hannah smiled, a mysterious smile that sent a shiver down his spine. "I want you to figure that out for yourself, Henry," she replied. And with that, she walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. In the days that followed, the space between them seemed to grow, yet, in a strange way, Henry felt closer to Hannah than ever. He was obsessed with uncovering what she was hiding, what her true intentions were. At the same time, he felt himself slipping, losing control over his own feelings. He could hardly sleep, tormented by the sense that he was on the brink of a revelation. The 6 months were nearly up, but each day stretched on endlessly. Hannah had become a mystery, and Henry could not shake the feeling that his life would never be the same once he uncovered the truth she was hiding. As Henry sat alone, he could not stop thinking of Hannah, not just as the woman he had married on a whim, but as someone who seemed to hold answers he could not quite grasp. The need to understand her became an obsession. He had done everything he could think of to uncover the secrets she carried, but each answer led to more questions. Desperate, Henry hired detectives, dug into her past, and chased down every lead he could find. Yet it felt like every piece of information was perfectly placed, as though Hannah had planned it all herself. One night, after a late business meeting, Henry returned to the penthouse, noticing the balcony light was on. There she was, Hannah, seated with an air of quiet authority, gazing over the New York skyline as though it were her domain. Henry sensed that tonight might be the night she would finally reveal what he had been so desperate to know. But the thought of what she might say made his chest tighten with unease. He walked toward her, his footsteps echoing in the quiet room, but Hannah did not turn to face him. The silence was thick, as if both of them knew something profound was on the verge of unfolding. "I need answers, Hannah," he said, his voice steady, though his heart raced. "I cannot play this game any longer. You have to tell me the truth." With a deep sigh, Hannah rose from her chair and turned to face him. Her eyes, usually calm and measured, now held an intensity he had not seen before. "The truth," she repeated, giving him a bitter smile as she folded her arms. "Do you really want it?" He nodded, bracing himself, though he had no idea what was coming. The tension was palpable, building with each second, and Henry prepared himself for anything. But nothing could have readied him for what she was about to say. "You have no idea who I am, Henry," she began, her voice carrying a cold edge. "You have always seen people as pieces in your game, but this time, you were the piece. I have been running this game from the very beginning." A shiver ran down Henry's spine. The certainty he had always felt about being in control started to disintegrate right before her gaze. He tried to speak, but Hannah cut him off. "Do you remember the name Roberts?" she asked, her tone sharper. "Of course, you do not. People like you never remember." She paused, her eyes blazing with anger and pain. "My father owned a small company, one he worked tirelessly to keep afloat, until you came along and crushed it." Henry stepped back, his mind spinning as he tried to piece together what she was saying. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, confusion in his voice. Hannah took a step toward him, her face full of anger and hurt. "My father, Henry. He was an honest man, struggling to provide for our family until you stepped in and took everything. You ruined him, Henry. He lost everything, and because of that, he lost his life." She stopped, her voice breaking slightly, tears glistening in her eyes as she continued. "My father ended his own life because of your empire, your ruthless drive to succeed at any cost." Her words struck Henry like a physical blow, leaving him stunned. Vague memories started to surface, blurry recollections of business deals, contracts signed without a second thought, lives left behind as collateral. He had never considered the people affected by his ambition, but suddenly, it was all coming back to haunt him. He tried to interrupt, his voice desperate. "Hannah, I did not know." "No," she shouted, cutting him off, her anger flaring. "You have no idea what you did. This was never just about money, Henry. You tore lives apart without a second thought. You took my father from me, the only family I had. While you thrived, my mother and I were left in debt, struggling just to survive." Henry was speechless. He wanted to defend himself, to explain, but the words would not come. All he could do was stand there, feeling the crushing weight of guilt settle over him. "I planned all of this," Hannah continued, her voice now calmer, though the resentment remained. "When I learned about your bet, I saw my chance. I played along, knowing full well what I was getting into. I wanted you to feel even a fraction of what I felt, to know what it is like to be manipulated, used, and left powerless." Henry's body trembled as he realized the truth. He had thought himself the one in control, the one who would win. But now, the tables had turned. He was the target, and Hannah, the player, had orchestrated everything from the start. He tried to speak, but his voice was weak. I had no idea. I did not know. You never knew, because you never cared, Hannah said, stepping closer until they were face to face. You destroyed lives without a second thought. And now, I am here, not to ruin you, but to make sure you never forget what you have done. I want you to feel the pain you caused, Henry, and that pain will follow you for the rest of your life. Her words fell like a heavy verdict, and Henry felt something inside him break. He had lost much more than just a bet. He had lost something he could never reclaim. Hannah stepped away, and the silence of the penthouse enveloped him as he collapsed onto the couch, feeling hollow and defeated. Her revelation echoed in his mind like an unending storm, tearing apart the world he thought he knew. The woman he had tried to control, the one he had seen as just a pawn, had flipped his whole life on its head. For the first time, Henry was at a loss, utterly out of control. After exposing the truth about her family's ruin and her father's tragic death, Hannah left him alone in the silence. She did not wait for him to respond, did not give him a chance to justify himself, because there was nothing left to say. The following days were filled with an unbearable quiet. Hannah's presence was a constant reminder of his failure, yet she acted as if he was not even there. At breakfast, she sat in silence, barely acknowledging him. When he tried to speak, the words caught in his throat, unable to bridge the gap she had placed between them. For a man used to commanding attention, Henry found himself feeling invisible in his own home. The absence of her acknowledgement, her silent treatment, ate away at him. He would watch her handle her affairs, speak to the staff, all while ignoring him as though he were nothing more than a shadow. Desperate, Henry tried to reach out one morning as she was getting ready to leave. "Hannah," he called, his voice raw, "we need to talk." She paused, her back still to him as she adjusted her coat. The silence grew heavier, and Henry waited, yearning for any response, even anger. But Hannah said nothing. She walked out without a word, closing the door softly behind her, leaving Henry with the painful echo of her absence. The indifference hurt in a way he had never felt. He, who was always in control, always winning, was now the one being punished by silence and disregard. Every time she left him standing alone, the feeling of helplessness grew stronger. But the silence was just the beginning. Hannah started chipping away at his confidence in subtle, stinging ways. At work, he noticed meetings being rescheduled without explanation, business decisions suddenly being questioned, and projects Henry had initiated at work started mysteriously crumbling, and he knew this was Hannah's doing, even if she would never admit it outright. Henry could feel her influence everywhere, like she was tugging on invisible strings that held his life together. At home, things had only worsened. Hannah kept a stance of cold disdain, deliberately distancing herself from every attempt Henry made to reconcile. She stopped sitting with him at meals, kept conversations to the bare minimum, and when he tried to reach out, her only response was a dismissive look, as if his presence itself was a bother. One evening, Henry found her in the living room, reading a book. The scene looked peaceful, but he knew that moment of calm was just a cover for something more hostile. He sat down on the couch, taking a deep breath as he tried once more to talk. "Hannah," he began, his voice low, almost pleading. "I know I've done terrible things. I know I have hurt you. But please, can we try to work through this? Can we at least talk?" Hannah slowly closed her book, but did not look at him right away. When she finally lifted her eyes, the icy coldness in her gaze made him shiver. "Talk?" she repeated, letting out a bitter laugh. "You think there's anything left to say? After everything you've done, words are worthless, Henry." "I was wrong, Hannah. I know that," Henry pressed, getting up from the couch and moving closer, desperate for any sign of connection. "I would do anything to make up for it. I can change, I promise." She looked at him, her stare piercing, as though daring him to prove his words. "Change?" she said, standing slowly, every word loaded with meaning. "Do you really think changing now will erase everything? Will it bring my father back? Will it undo the years of hardship we faced because of you?" Henry felt himself sink under the weight of her gaze. "What you do now," she continued, stepping closer until he could feel her presence like a weight, "isn't for me. It's for yourself. You'll carry this guilt for the rest of your life." Standing in silence, Henry realized that redemption would not come easily. There would be no quick forgiveness, no way to fix things. Hannah was beyond any simple apologies. In the days that followed, Hannah's disdain only intensified. Her cold looks turned his frustration into desperation. He tried everything, showing her that he was changing, trying to prove he could be different, but each attempt was met with silence or cutting sarcasm. One night, after a disastrous meeting at work where a major project had somehow fallen apart, Henry came home only to find Hannah on the phone, laughing. He overheard bits and pieces of her conversation and realized she was talking about his decisions at work. It hit him like a punch in the gut. She was behind it all. Hannah was dismantling everything he had built, quietly, cleverly, in a way that only he would notice. When Hannah hung up the phone, Henry was waiting for her in the living room, his face a mix of exhaustion and anger, with a trace of something else, pain. "You're tearing everything apart, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low and tense, barely containing his frustration. "At work, here, you're destroying my life." Hannah looked at him, expressionless, crossing her arms as she raised an eyebrow. "Destroying your life?" she asked, her voice calm. "I am just giving back what you gave me. Do not worry, Henry. I won't ruin you financially. That would be too easy. No, I want you to live with the pain. I want you to feel every single loss, just like I did. I want you to watch as everything you built crumbles, and to know it is all your fault." Henry felt the ground drop from beneath him. This was a nightmare come to life. He had always been the one in control, the one who held other people's fates in his hands. But now, he was on the receiving end of a cold, calculated revenge. Hannah was not out to destroy him in one stroke. She wanted him to suffer, day by day, loss by loss, until all he had left was regret. Weeks went by, and Hannah's cold treatment never let up. Henry, once proud and self-assured, now wandered through the house like a shadow of the man he used to be, clinging to a hope for forgiveness that he knew might never come. He was caught in a relentless cycle of guilt and pain, a cycle Hannah controlled perfectly, but the worst was still to come. One night, Hannah finally confronted him, colder than he had ever seen her before. She approached as he sat exhausted on the couch, broken and defeated. "Henry," she began, her voice calm but edged with a finality that cut deep. "You took something from me that I can never get back. Now, I am returning the favor, and you will carry this burden for the rest of your life." And with those words, she turned away, leaving him speechless. There was nothing left for her to say. Her punishment was already in motion, and Henry knew he would never be the same. He was trapped in a maze of guilt and despair, and Hannah had succeeded in making him experience what it felt like to lose control. The weeks since her revelation had been unbearable. No longer the confident, arrogant man who believed he controlled everything, Henry was now a shadow, a pale reflection of himself. Each time he tried to speak to her, he was met with silence or a cold stare. Her indifference ate away at him. He barely slept, consumed by thoughts of how he might fix what he had broken. But the weight of his past made that path seem impossible. In time, however, Henry realized that words held no value. Apologies would never be enough. Hannah needed to see real, honest change, and he was finally willing to do whatever it took to show her. He needed actions, not empty promises. One morning, Henry woke with a renewed resolve. He understood he could not just ask for forgiveness. He had to approach things differently. His first step would be to give her space, to show her that he respected her boundaries and would not push her. But he also wanted her to know he was still there, quietly, in meaningful ways. Henry began to pay attention to the little things about Hannah's life, details he had never noticed before. He observed her routines, her preferences, the things she enjoyed. He never followed her or intruded on her space, but mentally, he kept track of everything she liked. He noted her love of flowers, especially peonies, and how she took her coffee, strong, with no sugar. These tiny details, once meaningless to him, had now become his only way to reach out. That afternoon, Henry went to one of the best flower shops in town and bought a bouquet of peonies. He knew better than to hand them to her directly. She would reject them outright. So, he simply left the flowers on the kitchen table without a note, hoping the gesture would speak for itself. As she returned from a walk, Henry watched from the corner of his eye as she stopped in front of the bouquet. Her expression remained neutral, but she picked up one of the flowers and inhaled its scent. It was a small gesture, but to Henry, it was a sign, a quiet acknowledgement. In the days that followed, Henry kept up these subtle acts. He continued with small gestures, careful not to overstep. In the mornings, Henry started small, preparing Hannah's coffee just the way she liked it, strong, no sugar, and then left the table, careful not to impose his presence. He placed small things she enjoyed within her reach, leaving her little touches without forcing a meeting or conversation. Slowly, he tried to show he was paying attention, genuinely attempting to care for her. But Hannah kept the wall up. She wasn't ready to let him in, and Henry understood that breaking through would take time. Still, he wasn't about to give up. He was committed to proving he had changed, that he could win her back, on her terms, respecting the space she needed. On a particularly cold evening, he saw her standing on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket as she watched the city lights. After a moment's hesitation, Henry brought her a cup of hot tea, knowing she liked to drink something warm before bed. "Here," he said, keeping his voice soft and his presence unobtrusive. "Thought you might like something hot." Hannah didn't respond right away, but she accepted the cup, her gaze still fixed on the city beyond. Henry stood beside her in silence, trying to be there without crowding her. The quiet between them was heavy, but for the first time in weeks, it felt bearable, almost like something was shifting, even if only slightly. "Why are you doing this, Henry?" Hannah's voice finally broke the silence, soft but unwavering. Henry knew this was his chance, and he had to approach it carefully. Taking a deep breath, he looked out at the skyline with her. "Because I realized that my words don't matter anymore," he replied, his voice steady. "What I did can't be fixed with apologies. But I am trying to show you that I'm changing. I want to be better, not just for you, but because I know I need to be." Hannah remained quiet for a few more seconds, holding the cup as the wind tugged gently at her hair. The tension between them seemed to ease, if only a little. "You can't change the past, Henry," she said, her voice softer than he'd expected. "I know," he replied sincerely, "but I can change the future." She turned to look at him for the first time that evening, and in her gaze, Henry saw something he hadn't seen before. The hardness was still there, but there was a flicker of something else, perhaps curiosity. She wasn't ready to forgive him fully, he knew that. But this moment felt pivotal, a sliver of hope that maybe she wanted to believe in his efforts. In the days that followed, Henry continued with these small gestures. Now, though, there was a different energy between them. Hannah still kept her distance, but she no longer rejected him outright. She accepted the flowers, the cups of tea, even allowed him to join her for breakfast, though their conversation remained light and superficial. The barriers were slowly coming down, even if just a little. The real test came one evening when Henry was about to leave for a meeting. Dressed and ready to go, he was taken aback when Hannah entered the room with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Could you cancel your meeting?" she asked unexpectedly. Henry paused, surprised. She hadn't shown interest in his comings and goings in a long time. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded, pulling out his phone to cancel the meeting on the spot. He knew he couldn't pass up this opportunity to spend time with her. They sat on the couch, a little space between them, but for the first time, the silence felt comfortable. Hannah seemed reflective, as though she were processing everything that had happened over the months. Finally, she spoke, breaking the silence. "I'm not ready to forgive you entirely," she admitted, "but I can see you're trying. Maybe that's a start." Henry's heart raced. He knew he couldn't rush things, but her words were enough to keep his hope alive. He realized the path to forgiveness would still be long, but he was willing to take each step, no matter how slow, if it meant earning her trust, and maybe, in time, her love. The evening continued with the two of them chatting about small, inconsequential things, but to Henry, it was a victory. He was slowly rebuilding something, carefully and patiently. Hannah was no longer an unreachable figure, and he would never underestimate her again. Still, a shadow lingered between them. Henry sensed there was something Hannah hadn't yet shared, a truth she was holding back, and he would need to be prepared for it. But for now, the simple fact that she was willing to talk was enough. The weeks that followed were a strange mix of tension and hope. For the first time in what felt like ages, Henry sensed real progress with Hannah. She no longer treated him with absolute coldness, though she hadn't fully opened up either. It was like a cloud of hesitation hovered over them, a sense that she was waiting for the right moment to reveal something. Henry knew he was being tested, and he was ready to endure whatever was needed to prove himself. What he didn't expect was that something much larger was on the horizon. Henry poured himself into proving to Hannah that he was a changed man, letting go of work commitments to be more present at home, ensuring he was available without pressuring her or seeking immediate answers. Small acts, like preparing breakfast together or talking over trivial things in the evening, became part of their routine. Gradually, the ice between them began to thaw, and he noticed that Hannah no longer looked at him with the same disdain. However, something still seemed to trouble her. Though they were growing closer, she remained reserved, avoiding any deeper conversations about their past or future. It was as if she were waiting for the right time to speak, yet Henry couldn't guess what she might be holding back. One quiet night, with rain pattering against the penthouse windows, Henry noticed a change in her demeanor. Hannah seemed introspective, even more distant than usual, as if she were caught up in her own thoughts. He resisted the urge to press her, but his curiosity gnawed at him. What was she keeping from him? What truths remained unspoken? Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, he spoke. "Hannah," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know there's still something between us that you haven't told me. I can feel it." He looked into her eyes, waiting for her reaction. "Please, if there's something you're still holding back, I need to know." Hannah, who had been sitting quietly on the couch with her hands folded, took a deep breath and looked away, avoiding his gaze. The silence was agonizing, but Henry knew he had to be patient. He understood that forcing anything now could undo all the progress he had made. At last, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and resolve. "You're right, Henry," she said, her voice soft but weighted with emotion. "I've been holding back. There's something I didn't think I could tell you, until now, but maybe it is time." Henry felt the air thicken around him. Whatever she was about to say, he knew it would change everything. He leaned forward, both eager and afraid of what might come. "Do you remember the company you destroyed?" she began, her tone steady, though her expression revealed a deep sorrow. "The one my father managed. I told you that you destroyed my family, and that's true. But that isn't all you took from me." Henry looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Hannah lowered her gaze, struggling against the tears threatening to spill. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "I was pregnant, Henry." Her words hit Henry like a tidal wave, and he stood there, blinking, unable to process what he just heard. "What?" he whispered, stunned. "I was pregnant," Hannah continued, eyes fixed on the floor. "And when everything fell apart, when my father was gone, and the pressure and stress of it all hit, I lost the baby." Henry felt as if the ground beneath him had vanished. He struggled to catch his breath, the weight of her revelation crushing him. The guilt he had carried now felt insurmountable. He had destroyed not just a business, not just a family, but also a life. "Hannah," he choked out, his voice barely audible. I had no idea. I never could have imagined." She finally looked at him, and tears streamed down her face. Despite the pain etched in her features, there was an undeniable strength in her eyes. "No, you didn't know," she said, her voice trembling with hurt and bitterness. "Because you never cared to know. You walked over people, never looking back. I lost my baby, and you went on living as if nothing had happened." Her words felt like daggers. Henry wanted to say something, anything, that could make things right. But he knew there was nothing he could do or say to undo the agony she had endured. I I don't have the words, he managed, his voice weak with despair. What I did is unforgivable, and I will never forgive myself for it. But please, Hannah, if there is anything I can do to make this right. Hannah stared at him, her silence weighing heavily between them. Henry knew no words could bring back the child she lost or mend the past, but he was desperate to try and ease some of her pain. After a long pause, Hannah took a deep breath, as though making a decision. When she opened her eyes again, the pain was still there, but something else had surfaced, something he couldn't quite read. I don't know if I can forgive you, Henry, she admitted. What happened? It was devastating. But, she hesitated,